My name is Claire Morgan. I am 30 years old, and I grew up in Austin, Texas. From the outside, we looked like the perfect family, but behind those polished smiles and dinner parties, I was always the one pushed aside. My father praised my brother Daniel as if every breath he took was a triumph, while my passion for cooking was brushed off as childish nonsense. Still, I held on to the kitchen to the rhythm of the knife and the smell of herbs even when no one believed in me. But nothing prepared me for the night. Daniel, in front of hundreds of wedding guests, laughed into the microphone and told them I was nothing but a waitress. My heart burned with humiliation until one moment changed everything and turned the room upside down. What happened that night, and how did it rewrite my family's story forever? Stay with me because this is where everything began. My name is Claire Morgan. I am 30 years old and I live in Austin, Texas, a city that pulses with music, food trucks, and warm evenings. From the outside, it is a place full of life. Yet for me, Austin has always been a landscape of contrasts, a place where I felt both seen and invisible depending on where I stood. People often told me I carried a quiet strength, a resilience shaped not by triumphs, but by the constant friction of family life. It was a strength I leaned on often in a home where every curtain, every dinner, and every word seemed rehearsed for an audience that never stopped watching. My father, Richard Morgan, was a banker who lived his life with the precision of a ledger. He believed in plans, in money, and discipline. His voice carried the weight of decisions already made, judgments carved in stone long before they left his lips. When he spoke, it was less a suggestion and more a ruling, the kind that brooked no challenge. My mother, Maggie, was the embodiment of grace and social polish. She filled her days with luncheons, garden clubs, charity events, and every small detail that kept our family shining in the eyes of neighbors and acquaintances. Her hair was always in place. Her smile perfectly measured her words, chosen like cut flowers arranged in crystal vases. To her, a woman's worth lay not in who she truly was, but in how she was seen, how the community whispered her name when she walked away. And then there was my brother Daniel. To my parents, he was the golden child, the fulfillment of every expectation they had carried into their marriage. He inherited my father's sharp business mind and my mother's charm. Real estate seemed to bend itself toward his ambition, and success followed him like a shadow. My parents looked at him as though his every breath was a prophecy fulfilled. Their pride in him was endless, their faith unwavering. I was not Daniel. From the time I was tall enough to reach the kitchen counter, my world was in cooking. The sound of sizzling oil, the scent of herbs, the quiet alchemy of turning humble ingredients into something warm and whole, those were my comforts. In the kitchen, I didn't need to fight for attention. I only needed my hands, my imagination, and a little time. Cooking wasn't just a pastime. It was a language one my family never cared to learn. It was a Tuesday evening when the divide between who I was and who they wanted me to be became unbearably clear. The house was filled with the smell of roasted chicken, polished silver, catching the glow of soft lamplight. My mother had invited the Hendersons' family friends and important business allies for dinner. It was the kind of evening where the air itself seemed pressed and starched, heavy with expectation. Daniel, as always, took center stage. He spoke animatedly about his latest real estate deal, the future of downtown Austin, the promise of new towers and profits. The Hendersons listened with eager smiles, nodding along as though his words painted the skyline itself. My father leaned in, pride bright in his eyes. My mother refilled their glasses, every gesture smooth rehearsed. Meanwhile, I had spent the afternoon creating a dish I loved, a risotto with fresh basil and Meyer lemon zest. I had coaxed the rice gently spoon by spoon, letting the stock absorb slowly, patiently until it was creamy but not heavy. I folded in the herbs at the last moment, wanting their flavor to stay bright. For me, it was more than food. It was proof that something as ordinary as rice could be transformed into comfort, into beauty. I placed the dish on the table between the roast and Mrs. Henderson's gelatin mold, my heart pounding as though I had placed a piece of myself there too. I waited for a moment of silence, a break in Daniel's story, and when it came, I cleared my throat softly. Dad. Mom. I began, my voice steady but quiet. I wanted to tell you about this risotto. I used the Meyer lemons we picked up last weekend and basil from the garden. I tried. Before I could finish, my father's voice cut across mine, deep and final. Daniel, he said, his face turned toward my brother, this downtown project sounds incredible. You're really building a name for yourself. Richard Morgan Jr. is going to be synonymous with success, just you wait. He placed a firm, approving hand on Daniel's shoulder. Daniel smiled modestly, though his eyes glowed with satisfaction. The Hendersons laughed lightly, offering their congratulations. My mother leaned in, her bracelets clinking softly as she poured more wine. The room swelled with their pride, their admiration, their certainty that Daniel was the future. And I sat there silent, my throat tight, my eyes burning. The risotto before me might as well have been ash. The voices around me blurred into a dull hum, the laughter rising and falling like waves that left me stranded. I fixed my gaze on a porcelain bird on the mantel, its tiny beak tilted upward as though it were listening for something better beyond these walls. I did not cry. Not there. Not in front of them. Instead, something harder, quieter took root inside me. It wasn't anger. It was resolved. A seed of determination planted in the soil of humiliation. They saw my passion as childish, unworthy of attention. But I knew deep down, I knew it was more than they could ever imagine. One day I promised myself they would see me, and when that day came, they would not be able to look away. The kitchen was the only place I could breathe. While other girls my age pored over textbooks for SAT prep or tried to untangle Shakespeare, I was bent over an old notebook, its pages smeared with butter stains and penciled recipes passed down from my mother. It was the one thing I guarded like treasure. To me, it was not just about ingredients or technique. It was the rhythm of the knife against the cutting board, the hum of the refrigerator in the background, the gentle sizzle when butter melted in a pan. Those sounds wrapped me in a peace I never found anywhere else in that house. My parents had a different vision for me. Richard and Maggie Morgan were both respected in their circle. To them, stability was the measure of a life well lived. My mother's voice was always soft but insistent when she reminded me where security could be found. Claire, she would say, finance or law, that is where a young woman finds her future. My father rarely added more than a nod, but his silence was heavier than words. In his eyes, my fate had already been written in neat lines across a balance sheet. Daniel did not let the opportunity pass to ridicule me. He would lean against the doorframe of the kitchen, his tie loose from another debate team victory or internship interview, his grin sharp and amused. "Still playing with your little cupcakes, Claire," he'd say, his voice dripping with mockery. "One day you'll be cooking for someone else, sweating over a stove just to scrape together a paycheck." His words cut deeper than he knew, small shards of glass embedded in the fabric of my confidence. Maggie, my mother, tried to soften the blow in her own way. She would look up briefly from the stock market reports or community newsletters in her lap and offer a smile. "Good job, darling," she would murmur, but her eyes always drifted back down. It was praise without weight, a polite gesture more than genuine belief. I understood that even in her gentleness there was dismissal, so I pushed back quietly. Every perfect soufflé that rose in the oven, every loaf of bread with a golden crust was my rebellion. The scent of vanilla and sugar carried both comfort and defiance. Yet even as the kitchen gave me freedom, doubt crept in at the edges. Each pat on the head, each smirk from Daniel added a bitter note to my creations, a taste I could not season away. It was a chilly autumn evening when I finally decided to do something bold. The smell of roast chicken filled the house, mingling with the dry rustle of leaves outside. In my room, under the weak glow of my laptop, I sealed an envelope that carried more than paper. Inside was my application to the Culinary Institute of America. I had poured my soul into the essay writing about food as if it were poetry about how kneading dough or stirring a pot was the way I understood the world. Every word was mine, unfiltered, honest. I had worked in secrecy. Late at night after the house was still, I would type quietly, my fingers trembling but certain. I even asked for a letter of recommendation from Mrs. Henderson, my former English teacher, who once tasted my blueberry scones and called them edible poetry. She agreed without hesitation, her encouragement like a flame I sheltered carefully. My hands shook as I pressed the flap closed. It felt like both liberation and betrayal, a choice I had no option but to make. The envelope sat hidden in the drawer of my desk, waiting for the right morning to be dropped into the mailbox. But secrets have a way of surfacing. I will never forget the moment my father found it. I heard the drawer slam and walked into my room to see him standing there, the envelope clutched in his fist. His usually calm face twisted into something stormy, the veins in his temples standing out. His knuckles whitened as he gripped it tighter. "What is this, Claire?" His voice was sharp, incredulous, echoing against the walls. "A cooking school. Have you lost your mind?" His eyes burned with a cold fury, the kind that froze me in place. "We've talked about this. This is not the future. It is not even an option." The kitchen had always been my refuge, but in that moment, it felt like it betrayed me too. The walls seemed to close in the air, thick and unyielding. My chest tightened, as though the room itself was taking away my breath. His words, spoken like final judgment, left no room for protest. It was a decree heavy and absolute. I wanted to scream to defend the hours of devotion, the recipes scribbled in margins, the countless nights where cooking had saved me from despair. But my throat locked. Instead, I stood there hollow and shaking the silence between us louder than any words I could have offered. That night I returned to the kitchen after everyone had gone to bed. The house was dark except for the thin line of moonlight across the counter. I placed my hands flat against the cool marble, trying to steady myself. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. For once, the kitchen did not feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a prison with walls lined in silverware. Still, somewhere under the weight of his fury, I felt the faintest spark. It trembled, weak but alive, reminding me that dreams cannot be unmade by a single outburst. I did not know what the future would hold, but in that quiet moment I made myself a promise I would not let his anger be the end of my story. In 2016, a thin envelope found its way into my mailbox and into my life. I had sent application after application into a silence that felt endless, and then this one letter carried a small, bright promise. Partial scholarship to the Culinary Institute of America in Hyde Park. The words were plain, the paper almost weightless, yet when I held it my shoulders dropped like I had set down a heavy crate I had carried too far. Hyde Park felt like a world invented for people who belonged. I arrived with a battered suitcase, my grandmother's recipe notebook, and a fear I tried to fold into the lining. The Hudson cut the air clean, and the kitchens glowed like a string of lighthouses. The first day I tied on a white jacket that did not yet feel like mine, and stepped into a room alive with clangs of pans and bursts of flame. Garlic hit oil and lifted a perfume that told me I was finally in the right place. Days blurred into discipline. Mornings began before sunrise, nights ended with aching feet. Classes pressed me hard, but I learned to trust my hands and my palate. For the first time, there was no judgment from Daniel's smirks or my father's sighs, only the quiet truth of whether the food on the plate was good enough. At night I worked at a crowded diner off Route 9, balancing trays while my back begged for mercy. The tips were small, but they kept me afloat. Sometimes I caught my reflection in the glass door, half chef in white, half waitress, in a stained apron. That split life was survival, but it was also proof of how badly I wanted this. Winter bit down hard. My rented room barely kept out the cold, and there were nights I went to bed hungry. When doubt crept in with the frost, I called Maggie just to hear her breathing on the other end, though Richard rarely spoke. His silence was as heavy as any debt. Still, I kept going. There were small victories that carried me through. A hollandaise that finally held steady. A quiet nod from a chef instructor who rarely gave praise. A classmate taught me how one spice could bloom if given patience. I began to see cooking not as a dream, but as a craft that demanded everything yet gave back moments of grace. By the time graduation came in May 2018, spring had softened the Hudson Valley, and my jacket finally felt like it belonged on my shoulders. I walked the stage diploma in hand and heard a professor's words linger above the applause, Claire. You have the makings to change how Americans taste their own neighborhoods. After the ceremony, I stood by the river, the breeze cooling the heat of the day. I thought of Richard and Maggie, of Daniel's certainty that I would never be more than a girl in a kitchen. But at that moment, with the jacket fitting me at last, I felt steady. I was not finished. I was only beginning. I signed the lease in early 2019, with hands that smelled faintly of lemon and steel. The space was nothing more than concrete floors, a stubborn vent hood, and afternoon light that fell in long stripes across dust motes. I walked it with a notebook and a tape measure, and the kind of quiet faith you do not advertise. Austin hummed outside guitars and traffic and cedar pollen, while inside I could already hear a future dinner rush like distant thunder. We called it Harvest Table. The name came to me on a morning run along the river when the sun broke clean and the air tasted like mesquite. I wanted a room where smoke and season lived together, where brisket could meet basil, and no one argued about tradition because the plate would make its own case. Texas barbecue fused with what the farms around us offered that week. Collards that snapped when you bent the stem. Okra that squeaked in the hand. Peaches that perfumed the walk-in before anyone sliced them. Opening week, we had more nerves than staff. I wrote the first menu on craft paper with a stubby pencil and taped it near the line where everyone could see. Smoked brisket with charred scallion chimichurri and a bed of blue corn grits creamy as a lullaby. Grilled Gulf shrimp tossed with warm field peas, tomato water, and the tiniest turn of chili that kissed the back of the throat. A salad of shaved cucumbers and herbs from a farm in Dripping Springs with a buttermilk dressing I whisked by feel. We lit the Edison bulbs and prayed the ice machine would not quit. The doors opened at 5, and the room filled with a low human music. Silverware chimed, chairs scraped, someone laughed too loud near the window. I worked the pass and tasted and wiped and sent calling pickup with a voice that surprised even me. Smoke stuck to my hair and my jacket, a badge I wore home like a secret. When the last plate left the line, I leaned both palms on the stainless and let the cool metal gather me. The food press in Texas found us faster than we found our rhythm. A reviewer came in wearing a cap that tried to make him invisible and wrote later about a new voice that cooked like it had something to prove but refused to shout. Another called Harvest Table, a breath of fresh mesquite from a woman who once carried plates for a living. I read that line alone at the bar after closing my feet numb and a blister burning on my heel, and felt the sting soften into something like pride. For a minute, I saw myself from far away, not as the girl balancing coffee cups, but as the woman who had built a room where people put down their phones and leaned closer over a dish that tasted like a good memory. Mornings began at the market. I walked rows of stalls with coffee cooling in my hand and talked to growers who spoke about the weather. Rain kissed the carrots and made them sweet, they would say, and I would taste and nod and order more than I planned. Back at the restaurant, I trained young cooks to salt earlier than they thought to listen to the sizzle for when oil is ready to treat herbs as voices, not garnish. We moved like a small orchestra that learned from each other by breath and habit. When a plate came back empty, the dishwasher sometimes held it up like a small victory and we grinned across the steam. The numbers mattered too. Rent payroll invoices stacked in my office with the weak lamp and the stronger coffee. I learned to make peace with spreadsheets, to choose the carrot and not the garnish when a decision cut close to pay, growers first because their work fed ours. I sent Maggie a picture the morning I paid off our startup loan. No caption. Just a screenshot of a balance lowered to 0 and a smear of onion on my thumb. She replied with a heart, and then called to ask what I would do next in a tone that held both fear and wonder. I told her to expand only if the food stayed honest and my cooks could sleep. We opened Dallas 12 months after opening Austin. The new space smelled like paint for weeks, and then slowly like garlic and smoke. I hired a kid from Oak Cliff who cut onions like he was playing a drum kit, and a pastry chef who could coax a story from a peach. Opening night, a summer storm tried to scare us, but the room glowed and the brisket held, and when I walked the floor, I saw strangers close their eyes on their first bite and I knew the rain could not touch us. Houston followed 6 months later with a dining room that felt like a porch and a menu that let the Gulf sing. We added snapper that flaked under a spoon and greens that tasted like someone's aunt had shown us how to treat them with respect. People started recognizing me at markets and in line for coffee. They would tilt their head and say, "You are the harvest table woman," and tell me about a dish that reminded them of a grandfather or a backyard or a summer that went by too fast. I collected those stories the way some people collect recipes. They kept me honest when the days got long and the noise got loud. One evening in October, I stood on the sidewalk outside the original Austin location while the sky turned the color of a ripe cantaloupe. The sign over our door hummed softly, "Harvest Table." In letters that used to feel too big for me, now felt exactly right. I could see my reflection in the glass along with the warm room behind it. Servers crossed with plates held steady like offerings. A couple reached for each other across the table without looking away from their food. The line cooks bent and turned in a rhythm we had earned. I remembered the weight of a tray loaded with coffees the way a rude snap of fingers could pierce hours of effort, the times I walked home with the smell of fryer oil in my hair and the ache of unnoticed work in my spine. I remembered Daniel's laugh that afternoon. He said I would end up cooking in some back room for men with bigger names. I did not feel anger then. I felt a steady promise walking up my ribs. I spoke only to myself and to the Texas evening. No one will ever again decide my worth by my apron. Inside, the printer stuttered and spat new tickets. The hostess lifted a hand to catch my eye, a small signal that a table wanted to meet the chef. I took one more breath of mesquite and night-blooming jasmine from the planter near our door and went in. The hinges sighed the way old doors do when they are used often and well. There was work to do and a room full of people who had chosen to spend their one evening with us. I tied my jacket tighter and stepped back to the pass where the plates waited like blank pages. By 2023, Daniel's face seemed to be everywhere. The Metro Chronicle ran features on his latest developments, each headline painting him as Austin's golden mogul. His hair was slicked back in every photo, his smile practiced his hand, gripping the shoulder of a mayor or a banker or whoever mattered most at that moment. He drove cars that gleamed like liquid metal under the sun, hosted gatherings whispered about in country club lounges, and strutted across galas as if he had been born to command the spotlight. In those glossy portrayals, Daniel was a king in his own right. Back home in the quieter world of family dinners, nothing had changed. Richard still brought him up first, praising the boldness of his latest purchase or the brilliance of his strategy. Maggie nodded along, eyes glowing with pride. When it came to me, I was still just Claire with her restaurant. My achievements were acknowledged with polite murmurs at best. It did not matter that Forbes had profiled me in early 2023, calling Harvest Table a model of sustainable dining. Within the Morgan house, Daniel's star outshone every light. I was left with the same old role, the girl stirring pots, while my brother was paraded as a visionary. I heard the rumors, of course. Old acquaintances leaned across cafe tables and lowered their voices. Daniel was leveraged to the hilt, they said. He borrowed against properties that had not yet sold, chasing bigger and riskier projects. But none of that surfaced in the press. To the public, he remained untouchable. To my parents, he was flawless. And to me, he was still the shadow I had learned to live beneath. One evening, Maggie called, her tone unnaturally bright. I could hear glassware clinking in the background, the kind of noise that belonged to cocktail hours and polished kitchens. "Claire, sweetheart," she said, "you must come home. Daniel is getting married." My heart tightened. Married with who? My voice tried to be calm but faltered at the edges. "Oh, you know Vanessa Lopez," she replied, as though I should have always known her. 31, a talented designer. Her family owns properties across Manhattan and a stake in half the boutiques on Fifth Avenue. They are perfect for each other. The wedding will be summer 2023 at the Driscoll Hotel downtown. Daniel insists you be there. After all, Maggie added, softening her words like a veil, "You are family." Those words floated in the silence after we hung up. You are family. A tether thin and frayed, pulling me toward a world that had long since closed its doors to me. I sat in my office staring at the framed clippings on the wall, reviews praising the food we served the teams I had built. Yet the old ache gnawed at me. Daniel's triumphs were celebrated, mine were tolerated. And now I was invited into his spotlight, not as an equal, but as an accessory. A week later, the invitation arrived. Thick ivory cardstock. Daniel and Vanessa's initials embossed in gold. Inside, a program dripped with excess. A Michelin-starred chef had been hired, a string quartet, flown in from Vienna, accommodations reserved at one of Austin's most historic hotels. Every detail shouted wealth and spectacle. I traced the golden letters with my fingers and felt something rise inside me. Not envy, but a weariness so deep it ached. Memories pressed against my chest. Daniel as a boy slipping me an extra cookie when Maggie wasn't looking. Daniel told me stories about cities we had never visited, about futures we had yet to imagine. Where had that boy gone? Was he buried under debt and ambition, or had he simply been consumed by the glamour of his own reflection? I stood in my apartment, surrounded by walls lined with framed articles about Harvest Table, each one proof of what I had built. They were not extravagant, not gilded, but they were mine. They carried honesty and sweat, late nights and quiet triumphs. And though they did not shine like Daniel's towers, they were rooted in something real. I would not trade that for all his spotlights. Still, the invitation lay on my counter, unavoidable. The wedding was more than an event. It was a confrontation with everything I had carried since childhood, with the hierarchy carved into our family, with the shadow that had never let me rest. I pressed my hand flat against the card and whispered into the silence, "I will go." Not for Daniel, not for appearances, but to stand there as myself. To no longer hide in the corners of his world, but to claim my own ground. The ballroom at the Driscoll shimmered with chandeliers that spilled light across marble floors, polished until they gleamed like water. Strings played in the corner, their notes delicate as lace, weaving through the clink of champagne glasses and the hush of well-bred conversation. It was Daniel's wedding day. The event society pages had been buzzing about for months, and I was only a shadow among the spectacle. I wore a navy dress, plain and deliberate, chosen because it felt honest. In that sea of sequins and jewels, its simplicity made me stand out more than if I had been wrapped in gold. I felt their eyes slide toward me, curious, dismissive, some pitying. I didn't need to hear their words to know what they whispered. It was in the way their lips curled, the way their gazes slipped over me like I was a misplaced chair at an otherwise perfect table. At our family's table, Richard lifted his glass every time Daniel's name was mentioned, his nods brimming with pride. Maggie sat beside him, lips pressed into a smile that was polite but cold. I had lived this scene countless times before, under different ceilings in different rooms, always the overlooked one. Tonight only made the pattern sharper. Daniel, radiant in his tuxedo, moved through the crowd as if he were born to it. Laughter rose wherever he passed, his confidence gleaming as brightly as the chandeliers. It seemed every gesture of the evening, from the string quartet's timing to the applause of the guests, had been orchestrated not just for his marriage, but for his triumph. Then, when the music softened, his voice took command of the room. Smooth, practiced, carrying that familiar undertone of cruelty wrapped in charm, he called into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, my sister Claire would like to say a few words." Gasps scattered across the tables, followed by the kind of whispering that prickles against the skin. My chest tightened. I knew him too well. This was no invitation. This was a stage he had built for my humiliation. I pushed myself to stand. Daniel leaned toward the microphone again, lips curling into the smirk I had known since childhood. "She's nothing but a waitress." The words fell into the silence like glass shattering. A ripple of laughter followed, not loud, but cutting sharp enough to slice through the thin armor I had tried to hold. My father's expression flickered with discomfort, but he smothered it quickly. My mother remained still, frozen in the posture of a statue. I felt the room tilt. The chandeliers above seemed too bright, their light pressing down on me like judgment. Shame burned hot in my throat as I walked to the stage, each step heavier than the last. The microphone stood waiting, tall and black, its stem like a blade. Daniel's eyes followed me, gleaming with certainty that he had already won. I gripped the podium. The wood was cool beneath my hands, grounding me for a moment, but my voice caught in my throat. Faces blurred into one another under the glare, their eyes a sea of judgment. My chest rose and fell too fast, the words I had rehearsed in secret evaporating. I saw Daniel's smirk widen, the same grin he had worn when we were children, and he mocked me, always followed by that cruel little laugh as if to say it didn't count. But then the air shifted. The murmurs stilled, replaced by an almost tangible wave of surprise. Heads turned away from me and toward the entrance. I followed their gaze and felt the hairs on my arms rise. Through the grand doorway, under the glitter of crystal light, stepped Eleanor Grant, editor-in-chief of Forbes. Her presence did not need an announcement. Authority walked in with her. She moved with the steady grace of someone who had no need to prove herself, her eyes scanning the room until they found me. The silence deepened. Daniel's smirk faltered. His shoulders stiffened, the certainty draining from his face as though someone had cut the string that held him upright. My father froze, a fork suspended midair. My mother's eyes widened, her composure cracking like porcelain dropped on stone. The laughter that had mocked me only moments earlier vanished, sucked from the room, as if the air itself had changed allegiance. Eleanor stopped near the stage, her gaze fixed on me. For a long moment she said nothing, and the pause grew heavy, stretching across the ballroom. Then she smiled, mum, but certain, the kind of smile that promised knowledge no one else yet had. I felt my lungs fill again, steadier this time. The judgment in the room shifted, the tide turning beneath my feet. Daniel had set the stage for my humiliation, but the light no longer belonged to him. In that silence, thick with disbelief and anticipation, something inside me settled. I straightened my shoulders. My shame loosened its grip. And in that instant, I knew the story Daniel had tried to script was no longer mine to play. My words were barely more than a whisper, but they sliced through the murmurs that floated around the ballroom. Congratulations to you both. That was all I said. No grand speech, no retaliation. Just that. And somehow, in its simplicity, it struck sharper than anything else I could have mustered. The silence that followed pressed on every chest like an invisible weight. Then the sound of a chair scraping against marble startled the room. Gregory Miles, a man I knew only through glossy business magazines, stood with a suddenness that carried authority. At 55, he had the kind of presence that silenced conversations without effort. He fumbled briefly with his phone, then raised the glowing screen high. On it gleamed the unmistakable cover of Forbes 2023. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Is this you? Claire Morgan, CEO of Harvest Table, Forbes, 30 under 30. Gasps rippled outward like a shockwave. The weight of the spotlight shifted instantly, almost violently. People leaned forward in their chairs, conversations froze mid-sentence. It was as if the air itself had thickened with revelation. Anthony Lopez, Vanessa's father, who had barely acknowledged me all evening, was suddenly on his feet. His hand shot out toward mine, his smile wide and polished, the kind of smile reserved for boardrooms and headlines. "Claire Morgan, an honor. You're truly the pride of Austin." His words dripped with warmth that had been absent before, as if success alone had rewritten my worth in his eyes. Daniel did not move. His face drained of color, leaving him pale against the richness of his tuxedo. The smirk that had carried him all night vanished, replaced by something rawer, almost frightened. Vanessa's eyes darted between him and me, her confusion plain, her lips parting as though to speak, but producing no sound. The ballroom buzzed with whispers now, but they weren't about my dress or my supposed insignificance. They were about me, about Harvest Table, about the magazine cover that proved my brother's mockery hollow. The shift was dizzying, almost surreal. I caught Daniel's jaw tightening, the muscle in his cheek flexing with rage he couldn't voice. His confidence, his armor of charm cracked under the weight of a truth he could not control. For years he had written my story for me, casting me as the failure, the footnote. Now the narrative had slipped from his grasp. Vanessa leaned closer to him, her voice low but sharp enough that I caught the tremor in it. "Daniel, who is she?" Her question was not innocent. It was laden with disbelief and accusation. She had married a man who painted me as irrelevant, and now she stood in the ruins of that lie. Anthony Lopez, oblivious to the storm within his daughter, continued his praise. "Harvest Table is on everyone's lips these days. Local sourcing, bold flavors, national recognition. You've done what few can claim, Claire." He squeezed my hand and I could feel the eager weight of his endorsement. To him, I was no longer the shadow at the edge of the room. I was a rising star. The irony wasn't lost on me. Minutes ago, I had been nothing but a waitress in their eyes, humiliated on purpose by my own brother. Now I was their guest of honor, though not by my own design. I looked at Daniel then, and for a moment my chest tightened with something unexpected, almost like sorrow. He had sought to diminish me, to elevate himself at my expense. Yet his arrogance had blinded him to the truth that success has its own voice, one louder than cruelty. He had underestimated the quiet power of persistence, of years spent building when no one believed in me. Around me conversations reignited, but they sounded different now. Admiration, awe, curiosity. I heard my name spoken not in derision, but with respect. Claire Morgan, Forbes, CEO. The same words that once would have sounded like a dream now rang in my ears as undeniable reality. Vanessa's face told its own story, the slow unraveling of certainty. She looked at Daniel, not with pride, but with dawning doubt, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. Her eyes flicked back to me, measuring, recalibrating. I didn't need her approval, but the recognition in her gaze was still a kind of vindication. Daniel opened his mouth, perhaps to deflect, to spin another tale as he always had. But nothing came. The silence that clung to him was deafening. For once he had no words, no charm, no weapon left. I felt the strangest calm settle inside me. Not triumph, not vengeance, but a clarity I hadn't known before. His cruelty had been a shadow over my life. But shadows vanish in the light. And tonight, the light was mine. The ballroom shifted again, but this time it was permanent. The story Daniel tried to script had been rewritten by truth itself, and the truth was undeniable, shining from that magazine cover like a mirror I could finally bear to look into. The wedding was still fresh in my memory when the headlines began to shift. The glow of champagne toasts and string quartets had barely faded when the cracks in Daniel's empire widened into gaping chasms. The Austin real estate star, the man who once seemed untouchable, was suddenly drowning in lawsuits and debt. Deals that he had once bragged about over cigars and bourbon were now nothing more than cautionary tales whispered behind closed doors. The newspapers turned on him with the same eagerness they once praised him. Real estate mogul faces federal inquiry. Austin's golden boy crashes. The words felt sharp even to me, though I was only their observer. His picture, once framed in glowing profiles, now appeared under grim headlines. Vanessa moved quickly, her exit as precise and cold as her entrance into our family had been. She filed for divorce less than a year after the wedding, her signature on the papers, nothing more than a clean cut severing herself from a sinking ship. The glittering friends who once filled his parties vanished overnight. Numbers were changed, calls, unanswered invitations revoked. They had all sipped his champagne, basked in his spotlight, and now they recoiled from the shadows of his ruin. By late 2024, Daniel was no longer the man commanding attention on magazine covers. He was the man standing outside a courthouse, shoulders slumped beneath a gray sky. I saw the photo before I read the article. His face was pale eyes, hollow lips pressed in a line that betrayed both anger and disbelief. The camera had captured him mid-step, his polished shoes scuffed by the weight of defeat. That picture spread faster than wildfire, plastered across social media feeds, attached to captions filled with mockery. I scrolled through comments that cut without mercy. Deserved it. Thought he was smarter than the system. The schadenfreude was palpable, a collective sigh of satisfaction from strangers who had resented his arrogance. My chest tightened as I read a strange blend of disgust and pity gnawing in my ribs. This was my brother, after all, the boy who once slipped cookies into my hand when our father wasn't looking, the young man who had laughed with me before ambition swallowed him whole. The courtroom became his stage now, but not the one he had chosen. Instead of applause, there were flashes, the relentless popping of cameras capturing his downfall. Each burst of light marked another blow, another piece of dignity stripped away. I imagined the sound of them in his ears, sharp and merciless, like nails sealing a coffin of reputation. When I saw his image online sandwiched between celebrity gossip and a sourdough recipe, I lingered. His collapse was not a story of numbers and contracts. It was a human unraveling. Wealth status. The fragile veneer of invincibility. Everything had been peeled back, leaving only a man exposed and trembling under the weight of his own choices. I will not lie. A part of me felt the quiet burn of satisfaction. The universe, in its strange timing, had returned a verdict no judge could deliver. He had mocked me once, dismissed me as nothing, and now he stood in the place he had consigned me to in his imagination, small, diminished, stripped of respect. Yet beneath that bitter comfort, there was also sorrow. Because it was not only Daniel who had lost. It was the memory of who he once was. It was the bond of childhood fractured beyond repair. Watching him crumble was not triumph alone. It was grief for what ambition had stolen from us both. As the weeks went on, more headlines followed, each one harsher than the last. Asset seizures, court filings, former partners accusing him of fraud. The city that had once crowned him its star now spit his name like an aftertaste too bitter to swallow. And yet, in the quiet moments when the noise of the media faded, I thought of him not as the disgraced mogul, but as my brother. A man who could not see that the ladder he climbed was missing rungs, who mistook arrogance for strength, who forgot that even golden boys can fall. The image of him leaving that courthouse stayed with me. It was not just the picture of Daniel's defeat. It was a reminder of how fragile all empires are, how quickly marble crumbles into dust. And for me, it was a reminder that dignity is not built in ballrooms or brokerages, but in the choices we make when no one is watching. The evening was ordinary until it wasn't. Harvest table was full that night, the steady hum of conversations weaving through the clink of glasses and the faint sizzle from the open kitchen. I moved between tables, offering a nod. Here a smile there, proud to watch the life I had built breathing all around me. Then I saw them. Richard, my father, entered first, his shoulders more hunched than I ever remembered, his steps uncertain. Maggie followed, her face lined, not just with age, but with something heavier, guilt perhaps. And behind them, almost unrecognizable in his silence, was Daniel. My family seated together at one of my tables in my restaurant for the first time. I approached slowly, my breath uneven. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the menu, though I suspected it wasn't the words he was struggling to focus on. His voice, once so firm and sharp, cracked when he finally looked up. "Claire." He said my name carrying more weight than it ever had. "You are the only hope this family has left." The clatter of plates in the background faded, replaced by the sound of my pulse in my ears. This was the man who had spent my childhood praising Daniel at every turn, who had dismissed my passion for food as childish nonsense. Now he sat across from me, eyes searching, pleading his authority dissolved. Maggie reached for my hand but stopped halfway, as if afraid I might pull away. Her tears fell freely, no longer hidden behind polite smiles or rigid posture. "We were wrong," she whispered, her voice breaking like fragile glass. "I was wrong. I should have defended you, encouraged you. Instead, I let pride blind me." She shook her head, strands of silver hair catching the light. "I see it now, Claire, and I'm so sorry." Daniel sat quietly, his eyes fixed on the tablecloth. He seemed smaller somehow, shrunken under the weight of disgrace. His voice, when it came, was barely more than a murmur. "You won, Claire. You built something real, something lasting. I couldn't hold on to anything. I mocked you, and I mocked what you loved, but you. His throat tightened, and he forced the words out. You're the real winner. And I'm sorry. I studied him, my brother who had once sneered at me, who had turned me into a punchline at his wedding. His tuxedo had been replaced with a plain shirt, his carefully groomed hair now disheveled. There was no arrogance left, only exhaustion. A bitter laugh escaped my chest before I could stop it. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms, holding their stares with a steadiness I didn't know I had. In your eyes, I was nothing but a waitress. I said, my voice clear and steady despite the storm rising inside me. And you were right. I am still a waitress. But I am a waitress who built an empire from nothing, an empire that carries my name and my vision. Their silence was a living thing at the table, heavy and suffocating. Richard looked as though he wanted to protest, to explain, but the words never came. Maggie's tears grew heavier, falling onto her napkin, her shoulders trembling. Daniel bowed his head lower, his hands clenched together as if in prayer. I stood the chair, scraping softly against the floor. The room seemed to still the energy around us, shifting. My staff noticed but wisely kept their distance. I let the moment hang in the air, let them feel the finality of it, the weight of what they had lost. You wanted me to be less, I said quietly, though each word struck with precision. Now you will have to live with the truth. I will never be less again. I turned and walked away, leaving them at the table they had chosen. The sound of my heels against the polished floor echoed like a drumbeat. I didn't look back, though I could feel their eyes following me. I didn't need to see their faces to know the collapse had come. Behind me, silence lingered where voices once filled the space. My father stripped of pride. My mother drowning in regret. My brother humbled in a way I had never thought possible. I moved through the restaurant past the warm glow of Edison bulbs and the familiar scent of smoked brisket and fresh herbs. Customers smiled as I passed, raising glasses in quiet toasts I hadn't earned in that moment, but felt deeply. My staff nodded at me, their loyalty unshaken. And somewhere in the back of the kitchen, where the air was thick with steam and the clang of pots, I thought of my grandmother's worn recipe book still on the shelf in my office. The same book I had carried the night I fled home. The same book that had guided me when no one else believed. That night I didn't need to open it. I already knew what it stood for. Strength, survival, a legacy that had nothing to do with money or appearances. When I stepped outside into the cool night air, the city of Austin buzzing softly around me, I breathed in deeply. My family sat inside undone while I stood free, not untouched by their pain, but no longer defined by it. I had waited years for their approval, their recognition, their love. But as I walked away from that table, I realized I no longer needed any of it. I had already won. The scent of roasted garlic and rosemary lingered in the air, warm and familiar, as I stood inside the bustling kitchen of Harvest Table. The rhythm of knives against cutting boards and the steady murmur of voices blended into a harmony I knew by heart. This was no longer just a single restaurant in Austin. By 2021, we had expanded into Denver and soon after Seattle. Each new location carried the same vision I had clung to since the beginning: farm-to-table, honest food, sustainable partnerships with local farmers who still had dirt on their hands when they shook mine. Walking through the dining room in Denver one evening, I paused to watch the families gathered at the long wooden tables. Children laughed, tearing into cornbread, parents raised glasses, and a hum of gratitude filled the air. It reminded me of how far I had come from those greasy diner shifts where customers barely noticed me. Now every plate was a statement, a declaration that food was more than sustenance. It was dignity, community, and connection. The local papers picked up our story. Headlines began to shift, no longer dismissing me as a waitress, but calling me something new, a community builder. They wrote about the free cooking classes we hosted for underprivileged kids in East Austin, where I showed children how to make something as simple as a vegetable soup. Their faces lit up when they realized they could transform a handful of carrots and onions into something fragrant and filling. For them, it wasn't just about food, it was about possibility. For me, it was redemption. The irony wasn't lost on me when I read an article titled, "From Waitress to Community Icon." The words felt surreal, almost mocking the sting of my brother's old cruelty, yet now reframed into something powerful. That phrase, once a dagger, had become my crown. Then one evening in Denver, as I moved through the dining room, I saw him. Ethan Walker. My chest tightened. My breath faltered. He was older, the sharp angles of his youth softened, but his presence still carried the weight of what once was. For a moment the years melted away, and I was that young woman again holding a tray of plates, watching him pretend not to recognize me. He stepped forward, his suit tailored, but his eyes betrayed him. There was no arrogance this time, only hesitation. "Claire," he said softly, his voice almost uncertain. "I've thought about us. About you. I made a mistake. I was wrong to walk away, wrong to treat you as less." His words tumbled out raw and unguarded. I regret it every day. I let his confession hang in the air. Once I would have clung to those words like oxygen. Now I simply breathe without them. My reply was calm, unshaken. "Ethan," I said, my voice steady. "The past is done. I don't live there anymore. My life is here, and I won't go back." His lips parted as if to protest, but no words came. He only nodded, eyes clouded with something like loss, before he turned and walked away. I watched him go, feeling neither triumph nor bitterness, only clarity. He was a part of the ashes I had risen from, nothing more. Weeks later, under the soft glow of chandeliers at Austin's annual Community Service Awards, my name was called. The applause rolled over me like a wave. Claire Morgan, founder of Harvest Table. I stepped onto the stage, the weight of the award in my hands. It wasn't heavy in the way metal usually is. It felt like years of work sacrifice, late nights scrubbing pans, and mornings spent negotiating with farmers. It felt like every moment I had been dismissed, laughed at, or ignored, now crystallized into something undeniable. Looking out across the audience, I didn't see mockery or pity. I saw respect. Real, hard-earned respect. My eyes drifted to the front row where children from the cooking classes sat with their families, clapping with excitement. Their smiles filled me more than any headline or trophy ever could. For a heartbeat, I thought of the old recipe book I had carried from my grandmother's house. I could almost smell the ink of her handwriting, see the flour smudges across its pages. That book had been my secret compass, my reminder that even in the smallest kitchens, great stories could be written. As the crowd rose to their feet, I felt tears prick my eyes. Not of sadness, but of awe. Awe at the strange, winding path that had led me here, from scraping plates in a diner to shaping futures in kitchens across the country. At that moment, I understood something deeply. My revenge had never been in Daniel's downfall or Ethan's regret. It was in this, in creating light from darkness and building something so strong it couldn't be ignored. I held the award close, not as a weapon, but as a torch, a new flame to guide me forward into the life I had fought so hard to claim. The studio lights were blinding at first, brighter than any dining room lamp or kitchen bulb I had ever worked under. They bore down on me like judgment, but this time I did not shrink. Across from me sat Sarah Jenkins, her voice steady, her presence calm, her eyes searching, but kind. The hum of the cameras and the quiet shuffle of crew members faded as she leaned forward, microphone in hand. "Claire," she said, her tone measured, "your story has reached so many hearts. Tonight we want to talk about family, about the ties that bind us, and sometimes the ties that break us. You once said something powerful when asked about family. Could you share that with us now?" I inhaled slowly, the cool, recycled air filling my lungs. A memory flickered, uninvited, sharp as broken glass. I remembered Daniel at his wedding, laughter spilling from his lips as he looked at me with scorn. The words he had thrown out so casually had scarred me for years. But here, under these lights, those words no longer had power. I learned, I said, my voice low but unshaken, that respect is worth more than empty bloodlines. I am proud that I kept my dignity. The silence that followed was heavy, but not hostile. It was reverence, the weight of truth settling into the room. I felt my chest loosen, a knot untied. I had not spoken these words for revenge, but for myself, and for anyone who had been told they were less. Sarah nodded gently, her eyes holding mine. That is something many people will need to hear. The interview flowed like a quiet river after that, weaving between memories of humiliation and the victories that had risen from them. I spoke of childhood dinners where my voice had been drowned out of Daniel's dismissive shrug when introducing me to Vanessa, his fiancée, then who had looked me over with the thin smile of someone certain they would never need to know me. I recalled the sting of his words, the way he had pushed me aside with the careless ease of someone flicking crumbs from a tablecloth. But I also spoke of change. The night an email arrived confirming my feature in Forbes, how I sat alone in my apartment, the recipe notebook open in front of me, its worn pages dotted with my grandmother's handwriting. That notebook had carried me through so many storms, a small beacon reminding me that simple food made with care could matter. It was poetic, almost cruel, that Daniel chose that same week to cut me down in front of strangers. Yet that contrast became my turning point. I did not say this to Sarah, but inside I thought of justice. Not the kind handed down in courtrooms, but the quiet justice of endurance, of surviving long enough to outlast the cruelty of others. When the cameras finally clicked off, I felt lighter. The applause from the crew was polite but real, a soft punctuation to the end of my story. Later that evening, back inside the kitchen of Harvest Table, the weight of the lights was replaced with the glow of the oven and the earthy smell of fresh herbs. I reached for a bundle of kale, the leaves cool and firm beneath my fingers, and set my knife against the cutting board. The steady rhythm of blade against wood calmed me, as though each slice cut away a remnant of the past. Beside me lay that same recipe notebook, its spine-cracked pages, yellowed, a few corners smudged with flour and oil. I opened it absent-mindedly and found my grandmother's risotto recipe, the one I had tried and failed to perfect as a girl. Tonight I had no need to cook it, but the sight of her words reminded me of the thread connecting me to something purer, something that had nothing to do with Daniel's scorn or society's dismissal. It was a reminder that my worth had always been there, even when unseen. I looked up at my reflection in the steel counter. The woman staring back was no longer the frightened waitress waiting for approval. Her eyes were steady, her mouth set in calm determination. I spoke softly, the words filling the quiet kitchen as though meant for someone unseen. I don't need revenge. My justice is living a life I can be proud of. The last light of dusk spilled through the window, warming my face. I knew then, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I had won. Not by crushing anyone else, but by refusing to be crushed. If you have ever been dismissed, overlooked, or made to feel small, remember this. Your worth is not measured by their eyes, but by the path you choose. True justice is proving to yourself that